Thank you for joining us for the Lifelong Learning at Home series presented by the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning. For over 20 years, the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning has been offering unique adult learning opportunities on Laurier's Waterloo and Brantford campuses. Our non-credit courses are intended for personal interest and self-education. We're pleased to offer you this opportunity to learn from your own home and are excited to be joined today by Chris Anderson. Christopher Anderson is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University. He received his PhD from McGill University and his BA from the University of Toronto. His research encompasses both historical and contemporary studies of Canadian citizenship, multiculturalism, immigration, and refugee policy. His book, Canadian Liberalism and the Politics of Border Control, 1867 to 1967, was published in 2013, and he co-edits a widely used introductory politics book, Studying Politics. Elsewhere, his work has appeared in various edited volumes and journals. Thank you for joining us today, Chris. We will now turn it over to you for your lecture, Seeking Refuge in a Time of Pandemic.
Great, thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you to Jen also at LALL. It's fantastic that you're able to sort of move online so we can continue to sort of work through the lifelong learning program, as important as it is. So seeking refuge in a time of pandemic. A lot of the work I do is on refugees and immigrants, as Lindsay mentioned, and in this last winter I was able to teach one of the LALL courses. So Walls with Gates, I called it, a history of Canadian refugee policy. So when the LALL was asking about topics, I was really thinking about this already in terms of sort of how is it affecting refugees around the world and in Canada, and as well, what do we think about that? What should we be doing? What ought we to be doing? And so I sort of was happy to leap at an opportunity to sort of think about this for myself and hopefully share some ideas that you can learn from and benefit from. And so I have a bit of an agenda for today, the outline, really some basic stuff I want to do. This talk does not require that you know a lot about refugees or Canadian refugee policy. I'm going to go through some definitions and numbers that are broader, more general, just so that we all have sort of a good context, a good foundation. And then what I'm really interested in is just the effect of COVID-19, the pandemic, on refugees. And from two perspectives. One is global, sort of the macro level, the world level, and the other is a very Canadian perspective, a local one. And then at the end, I want to sort of briefly touch on sort of what I call from here to there, sort of given what we know, where do we go? And rather than set up some sort of questions, I thought I'd maybe just establish at the beginning some themes that I think carry throughout or that are sort of meaningful reflection on this kind of issue. And one is sort of an idea of the meaning of community. Refugees, by definition, are sort of outsiders in a society. They're people who don't have a state, who are in between in some fashion and unsettled. And so the pandemic really allows us to reflect upon the notion of community. And in doing so, our connections to others, especially those obligations we might have towards others as human beings rather than simply as citizens. And so those are two themes I think work throughout this talk. The last one then is also the sort of question of who we are and who are we revealed to be when faced with a crisis. Often when there is a crisis, we have to make some very rapid and often difficult decisions. And we can learn a lot about ourselves through that process, often for the better, sometimes for the worse, but always with an eye perhaps to how we can learn moving forward. One last note before I dive into the material. By the time you are hearing this lecture, a lot probably will have changed. Day by day, things are changing. Half an hour before I started this talk, I got an email that actually clarified some ideas about what's going on in the health sector. So things are rapidly changing all the time. By the time you're listening to this, maybe some things will be worse. Hopefully some things will be better. But nonetheless, I think we'll still be facing any number of challenges, not just with respect to refugees, but more generally. And so hopefully this talk can sort of help you maybe to think through some of the issues that we're facing at that time. All right, so to begin with some definitions and numbers, and what I'd like to do here is pull back. Obviously, we can go back through the written record of human history and we find ideas of refuge, right, and providing refuge and seeking refuge. I want to look very much at sort of the contemporary period, and to think about that, we're really looking at the post-World War II period, the post-Second World War period, and for a couple of reasons. One is some of the obvious ones, the Holocaust. during the war with the Holocaust, some 6 million Jews who die, and some 11 million people who sort of die as a result of Nazi persecution. We're thinking a lot about the human condition and the consequences of when we fail to support one another through adversity, through persecution. So there's very much sort of a human rights context that emerges in the post-World War II period, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So we're thinking about that, and we're thinking about it in the context of refugees. We're also thinking about refugees because after the war, there are millions of people throughout Europe who are displaced. Some 15 million are displaced throughout Europe. So this is a real human rights, a humanitarian issue. It's also an international security issue. So states are thinking through what are our obligations towards one another, right? And also how do we help one another? International issues such as refugees fundamentally require international solutions. And so the UN, certainly in that post-World War II period, emerges as a framework through which maybe we can address crises that sort of and issues that sort of transcend borders, right? And certainly we can think of a pandemic as an issue that transcends borders, and as refugees fundamentally as issues that transcend borders. So two things that are created out of that that are really important for understanding the pandemic today. One is the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. It's created in 1950. And sort of set up to be an international body that can be responsible for protecting and also promoting the well-being of refugees. Okay, in this post-war period, and even before that, and certainly through today, we have a notion that the world is divided into states, right? And states have a defined territory, right? And within that territory, there's certain people, right, that belong in that territory. So you line it up. States as actors with a territory and a range of individuals who belong, usually citizens. The UNHCR is there for when that relationship breaks down, okay? And that's what we certainly saw in World War II, where the state did not take responsibility for its citizens. Indeed, it persecuted them, and other states would not take responsibility. So we needed an international actor who could step in to protect and to promote the interests and well-being of refugees. And so that's what the UNHCR was designed to do, is just to play that role. In order to do so, though, we need to get some definitions. And that's what the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees is about, an international document. And two things it does is particularly important for us are going to be to define a refugee, so that if we have obligations to people called refugees, well, who are those people, right? And secondly, then to begin to talk about what are our responsibilities? What do they look like? What should we be doing? Okay. So the UNHCR works with, and states work with, this definition from the convention. It's a pretty precise and in some ways legal technical narrow definition, and it needs to be, because states want to understand to whom are we responsible, who do we owe, right, an obligation to protect. But because of that, it does two things. It restricts itself in some ways to only some people, not others, and at the same time, it's still pretty complicated. And there are four dimensions that we use to sort of identify who is a refugee. Okay? So a refugee is any person who, A, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted, so there has to be at the root of it some sort of fear, but only for specific reasons. For B, reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. Okay? And there's two other conditions that apply. Those people have to be outside their country of origin or nationality, where they're from, right? And they have to be unable, or because of their fear, unwilling to go back to that country for protection. Okay? So there's a set of conditions that apply that define who is and who is not a refugee. In Canada, we have this definition sort of written into our refugee protection framework, and it's used globally. Okay? The second part then are what kind of obligations do we have? And the convention lays out a bunch. One is particularly important at this moment in terms of the pandemic, and so I want to put it in more detail, and that is the principle of non-refoulement. Okay, and that basically means, as it says here, no contracting states, so the states who sign the convention and agree to adhere to its terms, none of those states shall expel or return would be threatened on account of the grounds enumerated above, that is race, religion, nationality, membership, and so on. Okay, so states, by signing on, commit themselves not to return people who are refugees to places where they are fleeing from a well-founded fear of persecution. This is not, therefore, something we do as sort of a gift or as a privilege, but it's an obligation, and therefore there's a right that refugees can expect not to be returned to those countries. Okay, so in small parts, what we do is give up a bit of our sovereignty when we sign the convention, because the interest of that refugee is deemed to be more important. Their human rights interest, their human well-being is more important than the ability of that state to send them back to face persecution. Okay, these are both in some ways simple but also very complicated principles and ideas, and we're going to come back to them throughout this talk. So certainly not a full model we want to keep in our mind. All right, so we have a broad, that sort of very specific legal, technical sense of who is a refugee. But when we think about refugees, when we think about refugees around the world, we don't often have that definition in mind, right? We're not thinking, okay, do they have a well-founded fear of persecution on these grounds? We tend to have a more general idea, right? That refugees are people who are fleeing, and they're fleeing a number of things. It could be a targeted persecution, it could be some sort of generalized violence, it could be a civil war, sort of broad sort of conflict internal to a country or between countries. It could be something done by state actors and non-state actors. It could even be from sort of natural or human-made disasters. Okay, and so I think Syria allows us to kind of see that case. It's certainly a case that's in a lot of people's minds in recent years. So you have a map there of Syria in the brown, and all the purple areas with the large gray circles are places where refugees have fled, right? Given the instability, the violence endemic right now in sort of Syria, refugees have crossed that international border, right? So they had to cross over into another territory according to the definition. In Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt. So we tend to think of refugees often in this way, sort of these mass movements of population. In this case, some 5.6 million people since 2011. And we know they've gone beyond those countries listed on this map. They've gone further into Europe, especially Germany. And we'll probably most of us recall the Syrian resettlement movement in Canada, whereby some 73,000 have been resettled since January 2015. Okay? And so the connection with the UNHCR and the definition can sort of be made here when it comes to defining refugees, because the UNHCR is the one who, in Turkey, in Lebanon, and elsewhere, Iraq, around the world, will register refugees so we know who is a refugee, where are they, what are their needs, and for the UNHCR, how best can we meet them. Okay, so they serve that role, sort of ensuring that somebody is sort of thinking about and looking after refugees to the best of their abilities, even if other states won't. Okay, so that's our common notion of a refugee, the person who's fled the border for those various reasons. The brown part of the map has the circle there says total IDPs, internally displaced persons. And this is another important category of displaced persons around the world that the UNHCR is interested in or concerned about. And they often are the exact same as refugees in many respects. They're fleeing violence, either generalized or specific, or maybe sort of natural or human-made disasters, or they're fleeing conflict, but they have been unable to cross an international boundary. Okay, so in every other way, they look like refugees. They have the characteristics. They're facing the same sort of threatening situations as refugees, but they simply cannot get across an international boundary. Therefore, they're not yet a refugee. You can see the lightly shaded areas. Those are places where there aren't many IDPs. That is, that's usually where people are fleeing from, and the darker shaded areas is where they're fleeing to. And you can see they're fleeing towards the borders, right? They're going from that central out to the borders, often because they're trying to gain safety, perhaps in another country. Okay, in Syria about now, there's about 6.2 million internally displaced persons. And of course, the difficulty for the international community is because they haven't crossed an international boundary, it's harder to help and address them because they're still within a sovereign territory of the state. Okay, but they very much could become refugees crossing a border, or experience, and certainly are experiencing situations that are identical to what many refugees will be facing. All right, so we have sort of two broad categories we think about when we're thinking about refugees: those who have crossed the border, those who are internally displaced. And there's two more important categories to think about before we get to that last one. One is the asylum seekers or refugee claimants. And here the difference really is these are individuals and people who have not yet been determined to be a refugee. They might be. They have fled their country. They're looking for asylum, the very label asylum seeker. They've claimed refugee status somewhere, but we haven't yet figured out whether or not they meet more specifically that refugee definition. The one that loosely we use. Generally, we have large refugee movements, but now we really use it specifically for asylum seekers and refugee claimants. Okay? So there can be, in Canada, we often see this in the news, people who've arrived at the airport and they'll go to the border official and say, I'm here to claim sanctuary, I'm seeking asylum because I face persecution at home. Okay? In the news, it's also come up recently of people crossing the border with the United States. Quite controversially sometimes, we'll come back to that again, where they come at sometimes irregular places on the border, places where there's not a border official, because they want to come and claim asylum because they're afraid they're going to be sent out of the United States to face persecution in their countries of origin. Okay? So this is where that idea of non-refoulement really plays in importantly for Canada, since we're not often on the border with countries that persecute. We still have that obligation with asylum seekers and refugee claimants to find out if they're a refugee, because if they're a refugee under that definition, then we are obliged not to send them back to face persecution, the idea of non-refoulement. Okay, so very important idea there. Not every asylum seeker will end up being a refugee. Sometimes they're not. Their conditions don't meet that definition. Sometimes they still face real life-threatening circumstances, but they just don't meet that definition. Okay, so there's a lot of complexity in this in terms of how we do this, as we'll see. It's a very complicated process for states and for refugees as well. The last two categories, one are stateless persons, and often refugees are stateless persons. You could think here about the Rohingya who have fled from Myanmar. In 1982, the government in Myanmar, I think then known as Burma, had by citizenship legislation simply said the Rohingya could not become, except for narrow avenues, citizens. So even though they'd lived for generations in that country, they did not have citizenship. Right. So that's one way in which they become of interest to the UNHCR, because again, the UNHCR is there for when there's a breakdown between that relationship between citizen and state. Sometimes it's a persecution or violence. Other times it's outright rejection or denial that these people belong. Okay, so stateless persons, sometimes are refugees, sometimes they're not, but they're of interest to the UNHCR because of that breakdown in the relationship. And finally, there's a category that the UNHCR uses called persons of concern. And basically, this means all refugees, all IDPs, all refugee claimants, all stateless persons, and all people who have returned to their countries of origin because they hope that they can now go back in safety. So even after somebody has, say, returned to Syria, they continue to be of interest to the UNHCR because they want to ensure that their security is maintained and that they're no longer under threat. Okay. All right, so we have a range of definitions that we use when thinking about refugees, and the UNHCR is as you can see, a very broad mandate to address the needs of many different people around the world in some very different sort of circumstances and situations. It's complicated, is a word I often use when talking about this. So let's look a bit now at sort of COVID-19, and I don't think I need to talk too much about that. I think we're all been thinking about this quite a bit. Certainly at this point of time, about 215 countries have been directly affected by it. Probably as of today, I think these were yesterday's numbers, we're probably close to 5 million diagnosed. We're probably, again, more around 350, perhaps, thousands who have died as a result. And we all can have read about and felt, experienced the extensive social, economic, and political disruption that's gone on. There's almost no part of our life that's not been affected by this locally, all the way through to the global, right? So it's been profoundly disorienting. It has also affected 143 countries that host refugees. And this is where I want to begin to make a bit of a COVID-19 and refugee connection. Refugee numbers, this is again thinking about the UNHCR and how it categorized those persons of interest. In 2018, there were 70.8 million people displaced around the world. Okay, so that's 41.3 million IDPs, that is internally displaced, hard to get to help because they're inside another country. 25.9 million refugees, therefore they've fled across the border, right, and have been registered by the United Nations as someone who has fled for fear of their life. 3.5 million asylum seekers, right? Those are people who've gone to another country almost as individuals primarily, or maybe as a small group, to claim status, need to be assessed to figure out whether they are refugees or not. And the 3.9 million stateless persons. Okay, a couple of things to note again that sort of underscore why the intersection of COVID-19 is and will continue to be so difficult. 80% of that 70.8 million are in low and middle income countries. That is countries without as much infrastructure in areas of health and social services, with often great political instability, so already difficult circumstances. And COVID-19, as we'll see, sort of only increases some of the difficulties. Half of them are refugees around the world are children, and half are also women and girls. Okay, so a lot of different sort of needs, a lot of different sort of issues are going to arise given the nature of refugee population. Our mind, we often think about the refugee sort of as a male, young male, perhaps. A lot of the imageries around that, but it's a very diverse population. And the last point here about numbers is just a reminder that very few actually end up coming to Canada or the United States. So 1.7% of refugees are in Canada and the United States. So the crisis, and it is now a crisis, ongoing, long-standing, where many refugee populations are intergenerationally outside their countries of origin. The crisis very much is elsewhere in the world. We have moments of more intensity, perhaps, but when we think about the refugee crisis, it's really something that usually and generally is happening elsewhere. All right, so that's some definitions, some numbers to set some context. Now I'd like to move sort of to a global perspective and try to think about more precisely COVID-19 and refugees and what we know so far. And again, this is changing, as I said, all the time. And so I'm hoping to give the best sort of information that I've been able to get so far, but I'm sure a month down the road, things will look different in many respects. Now, making a bad situation much worse, I think kind of captures it. Refugees, other displaced people belong to the most marginalized, vulnerable members of society around the world. That's not just in refugee camps or in cities somewhere else, but also in Canada as well. And the effects they already are experiencing in terms of marginalization, vulnerability, insecurity, precarity, these are only magnified for refugees due to the COVID-19. Okay. And so there's some areas where we can certainly think about this, compounding risks due to inadequate access to water and sanitation, as well as education, health, housing. These are already generalized conditions for many refugees, in fact, most refugees around the world. And has been put, how do you social distance when you're in tightly and sort of high population density levels in a refugee camp? How do you wash your hands when you don't have access to water and may have to walk considerable distances to get it? Okay, so all these conditions that are already put sort of refugees in sort of a marginalized and precarious position are only augmented. And they're not only just augmented because the services and standards are already sort of problematic, but deteriorating labor market conditions. Everybody around the world, we've seen this, we certainly see it locally. Access to work has dramatically decreased. The ability to sort of make ends meet is difficult. For refugees, it always has been. And they very much have lived a sort of hand-to-mouth existence quite often. And with the shutdown of the economies, there's just simply less access to the labor market. Where there is access often, and we'll see this a bit later in the Canadian context, it is to some of the riskier areas, whether it sort of be in sort of the services, the front lines, in healthcare even, in Canada, meat packing, in warehousing, places where people are more at risk of contracting COVID-19. Often refugees are working in these sorts of conditions. So less access to the labor market and really precarious, risky work where they do have access. Okay? Many countries in which refugees live are politically unstable. There's always been elements of violence with a lot of refugee camps and a lot of cities. Not just abroad, but in Canada as well. With the sort of increasing tension, with increasing anxiety, there's reports of increasing violence, certainly against foreigners as refugees are perceived, right? We already knew before that women in sort of crisis settings, high percentages face forms of gender-based violence, and certainly the reporting coming out is this is increasing under the conditions of COVID-19. And we've seen that also in Canadian society as well, but certainly affects refugees specifically. I mean, one last sort of way in which is making a bad situation worse, decreasing resettlement and asylum options. So there are approximately 167 countries have either fully or partially closed their borders, and at least 57 of those are making no exceptions for people seeking protection, that is refugees. So we're shutting down borders to refugees. There's some 70 countries that actually have inland determination processes for asylum seekers, and they have partially or totally restricted access. And so even for people who can get out and try to make a claim, they don't have access to those procedures. Canada is among countries that has set up rules whereby we will turn back some refugees at our borders. And there are cases such as the United States, again, we're going to come back to this, who have stated quite clearly they would deport people from the United States who are refugees. Therefore, again, engaging that question of non-refoulement, our obligation not to send people back to face persecution. Okay. So there's this bad situation made much worse. At the best of times, often refugees are sort of below or beneath our radar. We sometimes see them in certain circumstances, such as the Syrians or Rohingya occasionally, but there's populations all over the world, and we don't really give too much thought to or don't engage with that, the issues they confront. And the last thing about making a bad situation much worse is that this decreasing visibility is only increasing. And here are some figures from the UNHCR. As I said before, the UNHCR, one of the important roles it plays is to register refugees, that we know how many there are, where they are, what their needs are, how can we best address them, to make them visible, right? You can see down here, I think at the bottom left of your screen, February 17th, about 18,000 people were registering that day with the UNHCR, down a bit from before, but still pretty high and consistent. By, what is that, April 13th, that was down to about 4,000. That's almost an 80% drop in the number of refugees registering. Okay, that's a significant break with past trends over several years. Okay, so we know that simply we're not seeing refugees in the way we did. They're not able to cross borders, not able to seek asylum in order to find protection from persecution. Okay, so we know that there's a hidden aspect of this that's dramatically affecting the lives of refugees. Now, the global response very much has to degrees been spearheaded by the UNHCR. In saying that, the UNHCR certainly works closely with the rest of the sort of UN family, World Health Organization, UNICEF, World Food Program. There's a whole sort of group of organizations within the UN that really work within the humanitarian field, right, trying to address those in need. But now the UNHCR does have some 70 years responding to humanitarian crises. There's a lot of staff in the field sort of directly engaging with refugees. So it's a really important coordinating role at the international level within the international community, but with governments directly everywhere from the local to the national, and with non-governmental organizations and refugees themselves. But one last thing we know is chronically underfunded, right? As the international sort of refugee crisis has unfolded over the years, and that 70.8 million figure that's been growing year after year for quite some time, UNHCR has long sort of not had enough funds to actually address the needs of refugees. And now it has this extra issue, an extra complexity to confront with COVID-19. So as a bit of a backdrop, it's there and it's engaged, but it's also chronically underfunded. And so it's difficult for it to fulfill its full mandate, even more so now. But it has developed some strategies and sort of has 5 priorities that sort of listed out as the ways in which it's attempting to address sort of COVID-19. The first one is community engagement. And certainly this is the notion that in order to address COVID-19, communities have to be involved. And that's both refugee communities themselves, but also the host communities. This is a larger conversation than just refugee protection. This is more of a broader public health question. And so there needs to be engagement if policies are going to be successful, right? And if we're going to be able to implement good policies, then community members, both refugee and non-refugee, need to be engaged and to be participating in helping to define them. So that's one of its priorities. The second, obviously, is protection. That's a classic UNHCR role to ensure that the protection needs of refugees are being met. that the processes that we have in place, whether it be for determining whether someone's a refugee or getting them access to services for education, that we continue to do that, and that there continues to be good communication for refugees and to refugees and to local communities about how this is all unfolding. Refugees historically, as much as often there's a response of sort of welcome and that sort of humanitarian sort of sense of gesture, there's often a lot of fear that comes with refugees and uncertainty because they're the unknown, they're foreign, they're different. So there's a lot of sort of risk communications that the UNHCR is engaged in to ensure that communities can communicate internally, but also with one another and get good information about what's going on. The third area is health, water, sanitation, hygiene. As you can imagine, just basic things that are essential to confronting COVID-19. Part of this is working with governments to make sure that refugees, and whether they be in cities or whether they be in refugee camps, have access to health, water, and sanitation. Basic hygiene practices are reinforced and made accessible. And where they cannot be done by governments and states, to ensure it by providing it by the UNHCR itself. So again, often it's stepping in to replace what really states should be doing, but states are either unable or unwilling to do. And it plays this role on this front line as well. One more is direct assistance. When people don't have access to work, they can't earn money. They can't earn money. They can't afford essentials, food, and so on. They may not be able to afford rent. They may not be able to have shelter. So a vital role of the UNHCR is simply, as it has been in other countries for non-refugees, simply providing to those in need direct assistance with material goods. And last but not least is education. We've seen it here in Canada. Again, the parallels between what we're going through as sort of non-refugees and what refugees go through, we experience many of the same things to different degrees. We've all seen the displacement of our education system, from our universities or lifelong learning all the way down to preschool, and the real challenges of trying to continue to be able to educate our children or to continue to educate as adults when you can't meet with it, when you're engaged in social distancing, right? And if any of you have children or grandchildren going through this, you'll know just how difficult it's been, even with the best efforts. And this is even more so in refugee camps, where access to education already is highly problematic, but so necessary in terms of ensuring that people continue to be able to sort of develop and grow even as they're experiencing sort of a refugee status and not sort of stagnate and get stuck. So UNHCR has been engaged directly in this as well, trying to make sure we can continue education in refugee camps, and where we can't do that in the classroom, to find ways through distance learning, just like us, and online learning as well. Okay? So a lot of different strategies, and again, a lot of it often looks a bit like we talk about here, right? And here is just a graph of the sorts of things they've been doing. And it sounds very familiar, you know, trying to get masks out to people, trying to get hospital equipment, gowns, oxygen concentrators, ventilators, 6 tons of PPE, medical supplies, housing needs, making sure people have places to go, hospital tents, right, in order to make sure we have places to take care of people. And then all sorts of just direct assistance, because people need direct assistance. Okay? So very much the response is something that we've seen globally for all populations. It certainly has a different importance and significance, and also a lot of challenges when it comes to providing these for refugees. And one more slide about the UNHCR, and again, you won't so much be able to read, I think, a lot of this, but I wanted to put up to give you a sense of the sheer magnitude and just the range of issues. The UNHCR is working I think at the moment, directly COVID in maybe 65 different countries. It's got 143 countries, I think, it's working with refugees in general on specific programs. There's a lot the UNHCR has to cover in terms of ground and diversity of circumstances, diversity of economic conditions, political conditions, social, cultural conditions. And this sort of gives you just a bit of that, just an inkling of that scope, right? And a lot of the work it does with refugees, with governments, and also with non-governmental actors. And I wanted to just maybe end this part with the UNHCR to think about one place to sort of give you a sense of, again, the sheer magnitude of what can be faced. This is a refugee camp near Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, populated by Rohingya. primarily, and they're again fleeing from Myanmar. This is the world's largest refugee camp at the moment. It looks like a city. It could be a major urban area aerial shot of a community in Canada. 800,000 people currently are living in this area, as a population density 1.5 times that of New York. Right? You can just imagine the challenges that will be faced. At the moment, the very first case of COVID-19 was only identified a couple of days ago. Okay? So this is the sort of concern that people have, is that we need to be prepared. And UNHCR has been working with the Bangladesh government and working with others to try to ensure there's some kind of infrastructure, but again, relatively little access to water, sanitation, basic hygiene. The enormity of the challenges is almost hard to sort of put into words. But so far, so good. But this will be one of those unfolding stories in the next little while as to how this, how well we're able to respond over time. And now, before turning to Canadian example, I did want to put one more slide up here. There often is a focus on something like the UNHCR because it's a very prominent organization and has been working for so long in this field. But it's good to remind ourselves it's not just the big players who have a role to play. And I want to sort of touch on three dimensions here. One is refugees themselves. And although the stories are somewhat anecdotal, and I'm sure we'll be learning a lot more as we have time to sort of learn a lot more. But certainly refugees themselves are engaged proactively as agents, trying to do what they can in order to address COVID-19. In that Cox's Bazar, I was reading a story about refugee women in the camp who have mobilized themselves, worked in order to become more informed upon basic sort of advice they can give to some of those 800,000 people in the camp about hand washing, respiratory hygiene, social distancing, as well as what to look for in terms of symptoms, where to get help if you think you have the symptoms, and also working more specifically with refugee women for cases of domestic violence and abuse, trying to make sure they can be connected to the supports they need. So certainly refugees are not sort of passive in this conflict, but are very much sort of on the ground working through, as we all are, but with very different constraints sort of the situations. The other group of refugee support organizations, besides people like the UNHCR, right? So these are non-governmental organizations, some of them can be very small, some larger. The case I had here was in Greece. In recent years, there have been a lot more refugees coming across the Mediterranean from Afghanistan as well into Greece, and they've been putting them often in camps, or they've been distributed through cities. There's a camp, Moira, on the island of Lesbos, and it has a camp that's designed for 3,000 people. At the moment, it's 19,000 people in it. So again, high population density, sort of rife for the conditions, right, where COVID-19 could spread. A number of Afghani women in the camp have started to make masks. And with the support of an NGO called Team Humanity, they've been getting them supplies, like high quality supplies. They're making 6,000 masks a day. Then the organization helps to distribute them with soap, with information about COVID-19 and how to maintain good hygiene in order, again, to try to, at that frontline grassroots level, try to address this issue. One last but not least one I wanted to put in here, sort of a reminder of, there's not just refugees, refugee support organizations, but non-refugees who are supporting, some in direct ways, making standard contributions like the UNHCR, others in more creative ways. And this was just a story that came up. Some of you may have heard it on the CDC about Prickles, the expert sheep at social distancing. And this was just a story where farmers in Australia, there were some bushfires around 2013, and they'd lost a lot of their flock and sort of dispersed, and they got most of them, but apparently they didn't get Prickles until 2020 when she suddenly appeared. And so they were sort of stunned by this, and the story went a bit viral because we were all looking for a good news story in times of difficulty. And the owners decided in the end what they would do is they would actually shear the sheep, and in doing so donate all the proceeds to the UNHCR. And they did so, and this was a quote, "We decided that the worst place on the planet to be at the moment with this disease would be in a refugee camp." So again, creative ways in which individuals around the world can attempt to do their part and sort of find a role to play in terms of supporting some of the most marginalized and vulnerable. We'll come back to a couple Canadian instances of that in a few moments. But that does allow us to move on to Canada. So we certainly get a sense of that sort of great complexity at the international level, great uncertainty, There's a lot going on, but there's going to be an enormous amount to do, right? And we probably are only at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the sort of work that needs to be done over time to ensure that COVID-19, you don't get outbreaks, places like refugee camps or in cities, and that refugees do get the sort of protection that they need or access to services that they need. Now I want to take a step closer to look at Canada. And it's a bit difficult because the subject of Canadian refugee policy is large. There's a long history of refugees in Canada. It goes back before Confederation, back to Loyalists, and so on. And so we have this long and complicated history and interesting history of being open, sometimes being closed, sometimes we're doing things for very humanitarian reasons, sometimes maybe for more narrow economic reasons, or even political reasons. So it's a complicated, uneven history. But I want to sort of take a point of departure from the 1970s, because that's when we started to define for today's world how we wanted to address refugees. And there's some really interesting things we've done, and some of which are seen sort of, very, very much as models for other countries around the world. But then again, there's also stuff that we've done that wouldn't be a model for others or ourselves. So we do that. Unevenness continues because the issues surrounding refugees have always been complex and often are controversial. And it's not just a question of one political party over another. Sometimes that is true, but all political parties sometimes can be more open and less open. And this has certainly been seen in COVID. That's why I sort of want to bring that to our attention. There's sort of two main dimensions to how Canada responds to refugees, and we can divide into overseas and inland. So I'll talk a bit about each of those. And then we'll talk about just more generally refugee and refugee claimant well-being as sort of as a more general category. Now, the overseas, there's a couple ways in which Canada works with refugees overseas. And one, I won't touch on it much because, frankly, we just don't know much about it yet. Not much has happened yet. Maybe, again, a month from now, we'll know more. But one is simply just direct support for refugees abroad. So ever since the UNHCR was created, Canada was at first a bit wary of such an institution. It didn't want to kind of create a permanent organization. But once it was created, Canada has been fairly supportive and fairly consistently supportive ever since then of the agency, both in terms of working with it directly through its sort of executive committees, but as well through funding. And funding in two ways: funding for the organization so it can keep doing its work, but also when the UNHCR, as it often does, come up with special calls for additional funding. When there's, say, for example, a crisis about Syria or the Rohingya, UNHCR will put out a call, and Canada has often been fairly responsive to that. In March, Canada committed $50 million in international aid to help combat COVID-19, some of which will go to the UNHCR, also World Health Organization, International Red Cross. In May, the UN itself put out a broader call asking for some $6.7 billion from states around the world to protect people around the world in some of the most marginalized or poorest countries in COVID-19. And the UNHCR is looking for about $745 million for its work, the work that we just sort of covered in the last few minutes. Okay? So Canada's not yet responded, but presumably, if we go by history, Canada will try to find that role to play, right, in providing material means or financial means that the UNHCR and other agencies can help refugees around the world. So that's one part of what Canada does. The other part for the overseas is the resettlement of refugees from abroad. And this is an important part of Canada's policies. There's two main categories, and there's a third small one I'll just touch on briefly, through which Canada resettles. This is when UNHCR identifies people around the world, right, maybe in Lebanon, who are Syrian, and says, these people are refugees, and we think the best solution for them is to be resettled in another country. They can't go back home. They can't stay where they are. They're vulnerable, they're at risk. So the best option would be for another country to settle them. And Canada has very much for a long time been an important part of that sort of policy. In part maybe because we're a country of immigration, and so the idea of immigrants resettling and refugees resettling, we're used to that, and that's part of how we developed as a country. So it fits very much with our history. But there's two main ways that happens. Sometimes it's done by government sponsorship. That is, the government of Canada on behalf of all Canadians says, okay, we're going to take in, say, for example, 7,000 refugees this year from around the world. The UNHCR will help identify them, and then we'll resettle them in Canada to become permanent residents and then eventually citizens. And we've done this for a long, long time, right? The other, and this is what's innovative about Canada, is private sponsorship. Okay? And this is something that came in our own legislation about 1978. We're unique around the world for the way in which we do this. Other countries have sort of seen it as a potential model and have tried to adapt it. Certainly they did after Syria. And this is where 5 Canadians can get together, right, and decide that they would like to sponsor a refugee to be resettled in Canada. Or faith-based organizations or other sort of refugee support groups, if they're called sponsorship agreement holders, and make an agreement with the government that they will help facilitate this process, okay? So this is citizen-driven, or at least community-driven, right? So that people in Canada can have a say in how Canada resettles refugees and make their own financial commitment. So usually the group of 5 or the organization will assist that refugee financially fully for that first year, and then also help them integrate into Canada, get used to Canada, whether it's getting your children registered in school, finding a doctor, working in order to get the internet hooked up, opening a bank account, meeting neighbors, public transit, anything and everything. These individuals, these groups will assist those refugees to transition and sort of find their new life in Canada. Okay, so a really, really important part of Canadian policy. The last one is just called a blended sponsorship, and that's a kind of combination of both, where the government and the private groups sort of share that commitment. Okay? And we'll come back in a moment to this. The thing to remember about these is the government has full control over how many people come. It chooses the number of government sponsored, it chooses the number of private sponsored, it chooses blended. Okay, so some of the government can always maintain that control and decide how many to let in. Where government can have less control sometimes is inland refugee policy. And this deals more with the asylum seekers we talked about, people who show up at the border and say, I'm seeking protection from persecution. I have a refugee claim to make, and I want you to hear it. Okay? And so this ties back in more directly for Canada, our questions of non-refoulement, the idea that when somebody comes and claims refugee status, we don't know yet if they're a refugee. And the only way to find out is to listen to their story, to ask questions, to look into their situation and make a determination, inland refugee determination, okay? And if you remember that back to that definition, that can be hard. When you think about things like a well-founded fear, how do you determine if someone has a well-founded fear versus a not as well-founded fear, right? And how do you make sure you fit into that category, those 4 categories, the enumerated categories, race, religion, and so on? Do they fit? How do you make that claim? And if you're a refugee fleeing, refugee claimant, asylum seeker, maybe you don't have a lot of documentation, right? Maybe you don't have your passport, maybe you don't have so a lot of it is when people don't have that hard evidence that ideally we'd like, how do we at least ensure they're credible? So over the years, Canada has sort of set up a process. Again, this is one of the more controversial areas because it's really about state sovereignty to some degree. On the one hand, states, as sovereign states, like to control their territory, their borders, their population, who gets to stay, who doesn't, as part of state sovereignty. And this is being challenged by refugee rights, the right of somebody under the Convention, even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to seek asylum, right? And the idea we can't send them away until we know they're not a refugee. Otherwise, we're committing refoulement. We're going against that principle and against our obligations, right, under the International Convention. Okay, so it's a very complicated area. 2 dimensions of it that are really important. One is access and one is fairness. So in part, states sometimes try to control access to that refugee determination process. After all, people have to get here in order to make a claim. If they can't get here, they can't make a claim. So all states around the world, Canada included, have sort of developed a lot of policies trying to kind of structure and manage that access. And sometimes it could be something like a visa. A lot of people were coming from Mexico to claim refugee status. So at some point we imposed a visa so people couldn't simply come to the border. We could already kind of screen them earlier and maybe decide some people couldn't come because we didn't think they should be able to have access, right, if the government didn't. So there's lots of ways in which we structure access. The one I want to talk about here, to be important for COVID-19, is something called the Safe Third Country Agreement. This was developed after 9/11. It came into effect 2005. And this is an agreement between Canada and the United States. And basically in the name of managing refugee migration, that is refugee movements into the continent, and originally with the idea of security, because we wanted to know who was coming to North America, what was their background, and so on. The 2 countries agreed that if a refugee claimant came to either Canada or the United States, they should make a refugee claim in the first country they arrived in. So if they came through to the US, they shouldn't then go to Canada to make a claim. If they came to Canada, they shouldn't then go to the United States to make a claim. Okay? So again, it's that effort that states often have to try to impose a little more control over a process rather than allow a refugee kind of the right or the ability to make choices in terms of where they think would be the best country for them to be. It's a little bit more about states wanting to impose some order and impose some control upon it. So the importance of this is there are some narrow exceptions. So if someone comes to the United States and then tries to make a claim in Canada, they can come in if they have family already in Canada, because that sort of makes sense, and their probably integration would be better. If they're unaccompanied minors, so they're children essentially, or they already have a legal right to enter, maybe it's a student visa or something. Okay. Otherwise, those people who come to the Canadian border should be sent back and are sent back to the United States. Okay? It's based on a notion that any refugee claimant has a fair shot in either country, that the two systems of refugee determination are basically equal, and therefore they should go to the first one rather than pick and choose, as it were, make a choice on their own. Okay? Briefly, I just want to touch on a couple points. Ever since this came in, it's been criticized, certainly by refugee advocates, on a number of grounds. The main one being that US generally on a number of dimensions has lower protection standards than Canada. They're much more likely to detain refugees automatically, and therefore refugees won't have, the claimants won't have access to say the news or to their lawyers, and they may face, often they're detained in prison-like structures or prisons, right? So this can be very detrimental to their ability to make a claim. These are people who are often already traumatized and they're subject to this. There are more time limits, right, within which refugees have to make a claim. 1 year, they cannot make it after that. And for gender-based claims, they're much less likely to be accepted in the United States and Canada. So there's some objective grounds for sort of thinking through the differences between the two countries, and in many circumstances, lower protection standards. And it ties back again to that notion of non-refoulement, that if they're rejected in the United States, but would have been accepted in Canada, then in a way, Canada, by sending them to the United States, is sort of party to a eventual process of refoulement, which refugees are sent away back to the countries from which they've been persecuted. Okay? So it's been controversial for a while. There have been court cases. There's one ongoing right now, an important one to challenge it before the courts, saying that Canada should not be party to this because of its obligations towards refugees and under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for individuals in Canada. We'll talk a bit more about that later. This is a long slide, I know, almost none of this one. The other dimension is fairness. When refugees arrive, as I said, or refugee claimants arrive, we have to figure out, are they a refugee? And what we tend to do here is a notion of credibility. Does their claim seem credible? So we need a process to do that. And Canada set up around the late 1980s something called the Immigration and Refugee Board, and within that there's a Refugee Protection Division, and its job is to go through each individual case. So everybody who comes to Canada and claims refugee status, job of the IRB is to listen to their story and then to make a determination based upon the information and what seems credible in the context of, say, for example, if they're fleeing from Myanmar and they're Rohingya. There's contextual information that's really important, and there's individual information that they have about the story that's really important, and then the IRB makes a determination. Okay? It's a lot like a court. Evidence is introduced. There's people can be questioned. There's a record, right, of the proceedings, but it's not adversarial in theory, on paper. It's not adversarial. So usually it's about everybody ideally coming together to try to reach the best idea of what is credible and what is truthful. Okay? We could do a whole course on the inland process and some of its advantages, disadvantages. In some ways, Canada, again, is seen to be a model because it's tried to create, or at least has the potential to have a structure that's really independent of the government, that can, to the best of its ability, make determinations with the best information it can. It doesn't always work that way. It varies over time. We've changed it a lot since 1989, sometimes and quite often, making it harder for refugees to get through. And it's a long and complicated process, this whole process of inland refugee policy. But the underlying goal of it is to try to avoid, or should be to avoid, refoulement. We want to make a decision whereby we don't end up sending somebody back to face persecution. Okay? And again, very complicated and very uneven history within it. but it does have that potential and sort of built in a way that could do that very well. And we'll talk a bit more of that in a moment. Last but not least, we will talk about refugee and refugee claimant well-being, because after all, that's really important too. Whether they're treated fairly within a process may be different to whether they have a place to live and food on the table. And so we want to talk a bit about that in the context of COVID-19. All right, so the first part here, I'll just give you some numbers, because again, you can see there's a lot of variation, a lot of change over time. It's not a very static area, it's very dynamic. Sometimes it's responding to events around the world, and that leads to an increase or decrease in numbers. And sometimes it's responding to dynamics internal to Canada in terms of how we think and rethink about our relationship with refugees. And this is just some figures from 1979 to 2014. I'll point out a couple of things I think are interesting or tell us a bit about how this works. If you look at that light blue line, that's says they're the solid line, the GARs. Those are the government-assisted refugees. So you can see at various points in time, 1979, we're upwards about 20,000. It went down a bit, it rose a bit, it went down a bit, and it's been pretty stable over time. And again, this is something the government has control over. It can control who it agrees to bring in, because that selection process is overseas. They're not people coming to Canada to ask, they're people that we are choosing from abroad. And you can see certainly in the 1970s, late 1970s, that was the Vietnam era, the Vietnamese refugees, where Canada took in a lot of refugees at that point in time in response to that crisis. 89, 90, 91 and on, that's a bit of the end of the Cold War. People sponsoring, bringing in refugees, and a bit, there's some increases going on in sub-Saharan Africa around that time. And that dark line that's next to the blue line, that one there, those are the private sponsorship, right? So we didn't have it before 1979, but then we put it into our law, and Canadians really used it. Some over 20,000 private sponsored refugees arrived during the Vietnam refugee crisis, and then later, certainly the end of the Cold War, and again, the turn to the 1980s to the 1990s, a lot of private sponsorships, and then it decreases. Okay? And the important thing about that decrease is not a reflection of interest on the part of Canadians to sponsor refugees. But again, that's something about the government control, that the government can limit the number of refugees that are allowed to be sponsored. Okay, so after a period of sort of allowing more Canadians to sponsor, you definitely see a period where the government had decided that maybe it didn't want to allow as many refugees come to the private sponsorship. And so those two lines, as you get through into the 21st century, you can see them pretty flat, pretty stable. That yellow line, which then begins to sort of define the nature of that dotted blue line, which is the total intake, those are the inland refugee claimants, right? And there you can see a couple patterns. We get a spike sometimes, 1991, 92, right, followed by a decline. And you see that again, 2003, 2004, 2005, an increase followed by a decline. And more often than not, that's not about there are fewer people looking, right, to seek asylum. It's that we've imposed some new restrictions on our border, and they've been pretty effective. So 2005, right there, you see a drop from when we had about 25,000 down to 10. Much of that's going to be the safe third country agreement we talked about. We simply turn people away at the border between the US and Canada, and therefore fewer people could come and claim asylum. Okay? So those are a few of the patterns. Again, it gives you that sense that refugee policy responds to a lot of different things. Some of it about the outside world, some of it about the inside world as well. And you sort of tease those out. But the numbers can dance around a lot, from upwards of 55,000 down around 22 or 3,000 around 2014. Now, I said before that refugee policy is not always just about governments. All governments can be more open and less open, but certainly the election of the Trudeau government did lead to a change. And these are just the most recent numbers that I have for 2018. So whereas it was 22,000 in 2014, by 2018 we're up to 45,000, right? The PS is the private sponsorship, so a lot of private sponsorship again, whereas the numbers we see it there were lower, right, through that period, below 10,000. The government is now allowing more people to sort of come forward to support refugees through private sponsorship. Government sponsorship is about the same. The government really hasn't changed its commitment much, maybe a bit higher, but not too much. The BS there was the blended, that's where the government and the private sort of work with each other. That's a new category. And then the PP is the protected person. So those are really the inland refugee claimants and their dependents coming in. Okay, so the numbers certainly have increased in the last little while. And now it's time to sort of take a look at what COVID-19 has done to that sort of trajectory of an expanding refugee program. Well, COVID-19, both overseas and inland, has had a dramatic effect, as expected, perhaps, upon that. So for the resettlement of refugees from abroad, we were anticipating 2020, the government had planned for about 38,000 in total. Again, the overseas refugee selection, that's something the government can control, therefore it can plan, right, quite extensively the exact number it wants to let in. And it may be above or below for various reasons, but it's going to be pretty close to its target if it wants it to be. And here we had about 10,700 government sponsored, 20,000 were going to be privately, 1,000 blended. That is simply no longer going to be the case, where refugees were coming in January and February. With the March 17th, around that time, we closed our borders. There was a suspension of resettlement. So no more flights were going to come in, no more processing at that level is going to take place. And the restrictions were really here and abroad. There's a lot of processing that needs to take place, a lot of documentation to make sure you have the right person, to make sure people are related, to make sure that the sponsors here are able to afford, to make sure they're setting up everything in place for those people when they arrive. There's a lot of health checks, medical checks, security checks, or maybe DNA checks. And then there's also visas, exit visas from other countries, the processing of the visa for Canada. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of processing goes on. And as work shut down, obviously all that shut down as well. Okay, and then you add to that the lack of flights, right? The border restrictions, and there have essentially no new arrivals of overseas refugees for the time being. I'm going to talk in a minute or two about the effects on refugees themselves. For the moment, I want to just think about private sponsorship challenges for groups, because there's really two sort of sets here and a number of implications. One is we had refugees coming right up until that date. So people who had just met the refugees they were going to support and help to sort of integrate and learn about their new communities. And then social distancing kicked in, and people weren't being able to meet in larger groups. They had to be separated. It's going to be hard and difficult to go to a bank. It's going to be difficult to go get a medical checkup. The schools are closed. So all the usual things groups would do to support refugees in Canada, and the strength of the program, which is really about that direct engagement between people in the community and newcomers to the community, all those things had to change. Some of them simply couldn't be done. Others were simply much more difficult to do. And so a lot of there's a lot more challenging environment, both for those who had just come in the last few months, but even for those who might have come half a year ago and beyond. Okay, the role of those groups were really more difficult, because after all, they were at home now, and they were perhaps at home with kids, working from home. All the ways in which our lives have been sort of disoriented really took place here as well in this context, and had a pretty profound effect on the process whereby we usually support refugees in this way. The other way is supporting refugees to Canada moving forward. And a couple of things here. One is certainly with all the processing slowed down, because after all, the government has also slowed down working from home. We're going to be really far behind in terms of applications, simply because the sort of work that needs to be done cannot be done, right? And so that's one thing. We're going to see a decrease. The need is still great. The interest is still great, but the backlog is going to be considerable as we emerge through the end of it. And given the circumstances people find themselves in these days, we may find there are fewer people able at this time and for the next few years, or willing to privately sponsor, because for a lot of people, there'll be a lot of putting their own lives back together. We may find that the sort of that demand side, the interest, tapers off for a while, and so that can really affect the overall shape of the Canadian refugee program. So the overseas is pretty straightforward in that sense. There's simply nobody's really been able to come, and it's a lot harder to do, and probably will be harder for quite a while yet, maybe even a few years before we sort of get back on track, assuming everything else gets back to some kind of new normal. Inland refugee claims, I said this before, it's always worth saying again, is simply very complicated in a lot of ways. And so there's only so much I can touch upon, but there are a couple important things we can think about. 2019, some 66,000 people came to Canada to make inland refugee claims. 16,000 of those have come across the Canada-US border, not at regular border crossings, just Windsor, et cetera, but actually irregularly, that is between official border posts. Okay? So there's a pretty sizable movement of people coming through there. And we look at January, February, March of this year. January is pretty much the same as it was a year ago. January 2019, there were about 4,500 towards 5,000 people who came. February, though, it began to decrease. March, it began to decrease again. Okay. Part of this certainly is a reflection of the border closing, right? When we closed down pretty much the border to non-US movements, certainly made it near impossible for people to come to Canada to claim refugee status, and so therefore that's a big part of that decrease. The Refugee Protection Division, that is the group within the Immigration Refugee Board that hears refugee claims and makes determinations, between March 21 and April 5 received 304 protection claims across Canada. A year ago, that number would have been about 2,245 on average for every 2 weeks. Okay, so there's been a massive drop off in terms of the people who can access Canada and therefore seek protection from persecution. We're going to get to in a minute the irregulars, those who came across the Canada-US border, and those numbers have dropped quite significantly as well. Now, for that group, the big issue here was really around March 20 when Canada announced they had a border agreement with the United States. It was imperative, it was understood to shut down that border because the evidence was showing that most of the cases of COVID-19 coming to Canada from abroad were people coming through the US, not from China, not from Europe, but the US. And so Canada and the US worked to figure out an agreement whereby they could try to continue to have trade go back and forth because they're simply so integrated that sort of was deemed necessary, but they would limit other reasons, non-essential reasons why people would cross the border. So around March 20th, the announcements began there, and this certainly was more controversial, and we'll talk a bit about for a minute or two. Two groups that initially were said not to be allowed to enter Canada. One was refugee claimants, and the second was those individuals with symptoms who would be sent back to the US. And the claim here was that that was to ensure the safety of Canadians. That's a quote from Minister Blair. At the same time, that he said he didn't think that refugee claimants were any more risky to us than other people, right? Nonetheless, the border was shut down in that context, so people could not come to the Canada-US border as they could before and make a refugee claim. Certainly those are regular points, or under, it was not clear yet, the Safe Third Country Agreement. It seemed to be a complete closure of the border. Within days, there were reports that officials in the US said that those who were returned, if it was deemed necessary, would be deported by the United States. So again, this immediately brought in that question of non-refoulement. Would Canada, by turning people away from its border, thereby be participating in sort of enabling the United States to subsequently send people back to face to the countries from which they fled persecution? Okay? And Canada, this became a bit of a story in the papers, and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland sort of came out and said it's very important to abide by your national commitments, very much including when it comes to refugees. And they were said to be feverishly negotiating to make sure that the United States would not engage in refoulement of refugees. Eventually, around April, it was deemed that the Safe Third Country Agreement would continue to apply. So at official border crossings, people would be turned back unless they had family members here, unless they were minors, unless they had otherwise like a student visa that allowed them to enter the country. But that those individuals who were allowed in would be quarantined and secluded for 14 days, right, and to meet sort of health standards. But for all others, they would be turned back. So from March 21 to March 26, last year in that time period, there were over 2,000 people who arrived at the border irregularly in order to seek asylum. This year, there were 26, okay? 26, all of whom were sent back to the United States. 2 others were admitted to Canada under exceptions. Okay? So a dramatic decrease in the number of refugees able to access Canadian territory through the United States, even beyond sort of within the Safe Third Country context. Now, this policy has been subject to a fair amount of criticism. A number of sort of grounds of criticism. One is there was never a released text of the agreement, so we don't actually know what the terms of agreement are. Has the United States agreed not to deport people who Canada turns back. At the moment, when people come to the border, Canada turns them back and says, well, when things settle down, you can come back, and then we'll hear your refugee claim, right? But in the meantime, they might be detained and deported by the United States, right? So there's no written text to sort of tell us what the rules of the game are. It certainly puts people in danger, both in the United States, but also we know from the past, when restrictions come into play for people who are desperate to get in, they will simply choose more dangerous ways to get in. So rather than presenting themselves, individuals are more likely to try to get into Canada and hide for as long as they can, right? And that puts them in more precarious circumstance. Certainly it's not good health policy, turning people back. Certainly if we think they might have the symptoms, because we don't quite know what will happen. And we know now, certainly, that this virus knows no borders, right? Whereas the alternative would be to be able to get them treatment and get them sort of isolated from the community. And most importantly, or differently important perhaps, the notion of its illegality, that if non-refoulement means something, and we've signed on the convention, then we should not be engaging in policies that we can see a direct path to refoulement. Right? That's against sort of our own laws, or our own understanding of international laws and norms. And last but not least, there's the argument of, given the drop in numbers, Canada certainly has the capacity. If 26 people have arrived at the border, Canada certainly have the capacity to process them as we usually would do under law, and even to keep them for 14 days in some kind of seclusion, that it wouldn't tax our system terribly in order to do that. And that would also allow us to meet those convention obligations, especially surrounding non-refoulement. Okay, so that's an ongoing issue. The other issue is fairness. And here, there's just a few things we can say. And certainly, again, we can have a whole long course, and there's books written on the IRB process, and there's pros and cons, and there's certainly some serious criticisms of it, as well as praise for it. The one thing that the IRB has done, just like most all government actors have done, is it started to work from home. So all hearings, refugee hearings, were suspended as IRB members moved to home. So for the moment, everything's on pause. Nobody will be rejected. Nobody will have their process going forward. Those who already have the process done, they may still hear. They're trying to work on ways to get either a positive or a negative response to people. They're still trying to work on how the appeals work. So they're, again, like every other workplace, trying to figure out how you move this, right, to home and do it remotely rather than directly. But in the interests of the IRB and also of refugees, it makes sense to suspend it, and they have. Okay, so that work, it continues to adapt. There's seems to be a lot of stakeholder consultation, talking with lawyers and refugee groups to try to figure out how best to move forward. And the IRB itself has said that it wants to, the best of its ability, ensure that justice continues to be done, even if it's not done in the same way it was before. So that's been pretty important. And the IRB maybe has moved faster than maybe some of the Canadian border people to sort of take that pause. Two other areas that are of interest. One is removals have been suspended. So if you are found not to be a refugee, eventually you will be issued the deportation removal order. And since there's no transit really, and there's no way really to send people anywhere, those have simply been suspended, right? And so that seems a logical, if inevitable, sort of move to make. The more controversial one has been detention. There will be times when people who are refugees, refugee claimants, will be detained, sometimes in detention facilities, but sometimes in prisons, because we don't have enough capacity in those facilities, because maybe we can't identify them, or because there's suspicion they won't show up for one of their hearings, or sometimes because they're deemed to be some sort of threat to society. Okay? And so this issue came up early because, after all, prisons and detention facilities, those areas where you're constrained in your movements, they're highly problematic and high risk for COVID spread, right? But also difficult in terms of getting access to healthcare. They're risky environments in which people are placed. And so there are examples early on of some detainees going on hunger strikes, feeling that they were at high risk to remain, especially after there were COVID cases from the guards, both in Quebec and in Toronto, in the immigration holding centers. What Canada has done, on March 17th, there were some 353 detainees in provincial jails and holding centers. This number, as of April 19th, dropped by more than half to 147. Nobody, as far as I can be able to tell from the reporting, has been sent to detention facilities since then. And of those in detention facilities, a great number have been released on the grounds that if it's really to keep them there until they can be removed from the country, well, we're not moving anybody anyway. So since all those other operations have been suspended, it doesn't make sense. The risk is too high. So some are still kept in, but it's a risk-based assessment in terms of releasing them versus COVID-19. So there's been some movement along there, but it's still a tricky issue and a controversial one. All right, one more core slide in the Canadian perspective, and then we're almost about 3 slides more, and then we're about done. And here I just want to talk more generally about notions of refugee and refugee claimant well-being. So people who we already have identified as refugees, they've been resettled or accepted as refugees after their hearing, as well as those who have not yet been accepted or maybe were rejected in Canada. And there's sort of I sort of see it as there's sort of maybe a continuum of sort of community and inclusion that can occur. Certainly refugees who have been resettled often have community connections that are made. They have a stability and security of knowing that they are permanent residents soon and they'll become citizens. And so that sort of degree and extent of inclusion in community can often be quite high. Those who have been protected, that is, refugee claimants who have been accepted, often are close behind in that sense. They may not have that community engagement of the private sponsorship holders, but through their process, often they've made a lot of connections to communities. And that's an important part of sort of reestablishing themselves in Canada. For those who are very new, right, to Canada, whose claims are in process, or maybe even those who've been denied protection, they can live very much on the margins of both community and be very much excluded in some ways. But across the board, even though there is that continuum, refugees often have fewer resources to navigate sort of their uncertainty in Canada, whether it be financial resources or just knowledge-based resources. There's more barriers to language, cultural differences. There can be discrimination sort of more directly and indirectly, and also perceived social acceptance. We often have a sort of a language debates about sort of the real refugees and the fake refugees and the bogus refugees, debates about face coverings in Quebec, various ways in which refugees can sometimes feel maybe that they're not as welcome as they would hope to be. And that can sort of set up barriers for their engagement with the community and their sense of inclusion. That being said, on a side note, when we ask refugees, they have very high attachment to Canada across the board, very high levels of attachment and feeling like they belong in Canada. So that's sort of a counterpart to that, where that desire to be part of a community is very, very strong. And in this sort of era of sort of COVID-19 isolation, those sort of sense of at least the exclusion aspects, the barriers are also sort of reinforced by the sense that the groups that they would depend upon themselves now have to practice social distancing, whether it be community groups, religious groups, or directly refugee distance groups. There are fewer supports in place and they're less accessible than they used to be. So those who are already most sort of marginalized and most at risk, they're increasingly so. And because of that, in terms of public health, they're more likely that others at risk too. So there's a very connectedness that's important part of this idea of community inclusion. In that context, I was struck by a report, not perhaps surprising, but sometimes good to get the evidence, in Ontario that concluded that Ontarians testing positive for COVID-19 are more likely to live in neighborhoods characterized by precarious housing, lower income status, greater concentration of racial minorities, and is very much part of the refugee experience. Okay, that sense of marginalization, of insecurity, of vulnerability. And so certainly that effect on well-being, we've all experienced it. I think there's another level of profoundness and complexity for refugees. And I was struck by one story I read in the news. Single mother from East Africa arrived in Canada on March 20th. Okay? She was referred to a temporary shelter where she could live and put in touch with a lawyer to help her with her application for refugee status. A week later, however, all the Canadian offices closed, right? And the woman, she got an acknowledgement that she was making a claim and recognized that she's made a request, right, and gives her a degree of sort of legal standing in Canada, but it's not enough to get a bank account, a social insurance number, or a work permit. Okay? So the moment she was living in a homeless shelter and she had access to some basic social assistance, but without a bank account, she's having a difficult time even cashing the checks. So just a sense of the sort of the ways in which that refugee experience can be very much on the margins and very difficult. And that may be an extreme, but it's not uncommon. And the variations of that experience are great within refugee communities. And that's something to keep in mind. So certainly about categories, employment, I think just as many other Canadians, they have lost their jobs. The compounded effect of that, of course, is the fact that they already sort of live sort of in more sort of precarious and marginal status economically. Refugees eventually will catch up with other Canadians in terms of their employment and their earnings. That usually takes sort of 5 to 10 years, right? So they tend to be further and closer to the poverty line than other Canadians are, so that impact can be greater. The other side of the employment puzzle, of course, is that often they are continuing to work, but in some of the riskiest jobs. Okay? And so again, you can see it in the meatpacking industry, in warehousing, in the support in the elderly care industry, in the frontline service industry. That is often where you'll see refugees working in jobs. Parts and times are jobs other people don't want to do, and they're high risk to them. Okay? So that's been part of the sort of the well-being piece for refugee claimants, is that they're kind of in areas of high risk when it comes to employment. Overall, for economic support, there has been some good news when the government released the CERB, the benefits that was available to refugees as well as refugee claimants and even failed refugee claimants if they were making an appeal. So that covered a lot of people who would have access to that. Obviously, there still continue to be gaps, people who didn't fit those categories, and certainly if you didn't earn the $5,000, you would not be eligible for it. So there's still gaps in there, but at least at a baseline, there seemed to be sort of a commitment to a policy that would try to address a wider array of needs rather than narrowing it down to sort of a narrow set of categories. For health, that's been a bit more variable. In the case of Ontario, Ontario seems to have done a pretty good job because it has opened up access to healthcare basically to anybody. And so whether you sort of have documentation, immigration status, whether you don't, you have access to healthcare, and you don't have it just for COVID-19, but you have it for related issues and other issues. So they've sort of set the fewest conditions around healthcare access. Other provinces, BC, Manitoba, Quebec, they've been much more limited. Those who don't have status often don't have as wide an access, and sometimes the access they have is only narrowly defined in terms of COVID-19. Okay? But we know, of course, it's hard to understand the symptoms are always changing of COVID-19, or even the ways in which COVID-19 can interact with other ailments. And so this sort of narrowness may actually not be a good public health decision, and certainly it's not good for the well-being of categories of refugee claimants who don't have the sort of status that can get them into the fuller set of inclusion. So there's probably still work to be done on those fronts. So that covers physical health and economic support. One thing as a reminder again, there are factors for refugees that make it simply harder to access. Even if they have formally access, it can be harder to make to actually realize that access. Sometimes it can be things like knowledge and language and not knowing what to do and how to do it, or what documentation you need, or what's the process. It can also be a fear of using services because perhaps it may negatively affect down the road how you proceed. Often part of the debate is about refugees who come to take advantage, right, of Canada. As part of that distrust or that fear, part of that often the controversy about refugee policy. And that can be sort of something that's reflected in the actions of refugees. They don't want to be seen to be people who are taking advantage. Or for groups that are really on the margins, those who perhaps have gone underground, the fear of going to access healthcare, or fear of accessing economic support, because that might lead to your detention and maybe one day deportation. Okay? So maybe one of the lessons of this is sort of perhaps a need for a proactive outreach and something maybe more akin to what Ontario or the CERB policy is, just try to limit the restrictions on access in order that the greatest number of people can access as a public health concern rather than some other kind of concerns that we will turn to or close in a minute or two. And last but not least, mental health. Increasingly important conversation we have in Canadian society, certainly, and even globally. And certainly we're talking a lot in terms of the impact on the mental health of Canadians, of social distancing and seclusion, COVID-19, and a lot of concerns between Canadians. I think in terms of refugees, we can see that this could be compounded for a number of reasons. One is that refugees often come with a lot of mental health challenges that stem from their experiences before they arrived, in their countries of origin, the violence or persecution they faced, or their loved ones faced, or community members faced, the trauma of their experience traveling to Canada, and then sometimes the trauma of the actual time spent in Canada, whether it be part of the reaction that they see around them to refugees coming to Canada, or even just the difficulties they face in their day-to-day lives. And so you can imagine against this context and the extent to which, again, refugees tend to be within the more marginalized, vulnerable communities, that there's going to be some very serious challenges both right now, but also down the road in terms of recovery and long-term mental health sort of sustenance and sustaining. Okay. All right. Got, I think, 2 more slides I'd like to show you, and then we'll wrap it up with some concluding thoughts. And I didn't want to end just in the note. There's some positives, there's some negatives, and I didn't want to, again, end on the note, as sometimes we do, where almost refugees become the subject rather than the actor. And so I wanted to just share a few stories about refugees engaging with COVID-19 and the COVID-19 response. Because again, it reminds us that it's not as simple as our views of them, but also their realities in the worlds they create, and how that contributes to our world as well, and sometimes in very positive ways. And I just had sort of 4 stories to tell here. We have Asmir Begovic and Alfonso Davies. Both came to Canada as refugees, now play in European soccer. Asmir Begovic came from Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Alfonso Davies actually was born in a refugee camp in Ghana and came to Canada at age 5. And one of the things they did is they set up a match, and a online video game where they played soccer against each other, representing their countries and their teams, in order to raise money for the UNHCR. And Alfonso Davies, who's a young 18-year-old, sort of, I think he's one of the, said to be one of the phenoms or prodigies of soccer internationally, he said it was really important for him, as someone who had grown up in a refugee camp and had a direct experience, to really try to make a contribution back to help those who are still there. So those sorts of things going on, that's the international level. Selina Urbanovic is a refugee from the former Yugoslavia who came to Canada in the 1990s, and she is a expert seamstress. And so one of the first things she did was to simply make masks. She lives in Ottawa, so she was contributing them to the healthcare structure, whether the long-term care facilities and the hospitals. She made gloves, and for her, she said it was a really important way to kind of try to pay back all that she felt she had gained by being accepted as a refugee in Canada. It was a way of making a contribution to those who are in need. Oops. In a way that she was once helped when she first arrived. Another case, I don't have a picture here, but I think it's the Molina family. They came to Canada in 1972 when Idi Amin in Uganda said that all Asians had to leave, and they were East Indian from India, and Canada took in several thousands of Asian Ugandans, and they eventually set up a family foundation and just recently donated $1.6 million to 8 different hospitals in Canada as a way of, they said, paying it back for what Canada had done for them to allow them to resettle here. And the last one here is Sarah, in quotation marks, because it's not her real name. We mentioned and talked a bit about the thousands of people who've come to Canada through the United States, in part because they fear deportation under sort of the Trump government, and great many of them are Haitians. And in Quebec, you've probably all heard about the difficulties they've gone through in their health sector, especially for long-term care facilities. And there are hundreds, if not well over 1,000 Haitians who are working as refugee claimants, not as Canadian citizens, people whose status is not clear yet, working in that sector to help out in the long-term care facilities. Sarah herself ended up catching COVID-19 and then was at home with her young daughter for 2 weeks recovering. And there have been 1 or 2 deaths reported in the media of, again, refugees who have sort of gone to the front lines and helping out. So this is just sort of, again, that reminder that it's not sort of these things aren't segmented, us and them. There's a great integration, great sense of community in the end that attaches us in ways that sometimes are quite inspiring, Other times are maybe a little more disturbing in terms of people who don't even have a status, where in the end, maybe by choice, maybe because they simply need the work, some of them paying with their lives in order to sort of confront COVID-19 in Canada. All right, a second to last slide. And these are just a few things and thoughts I thought would be worth sort of, giving some consideration to. Kind of from here to there, where do we or where we stand? Again, at the beginning, rather than set questions, it was just really to, to spark some considerations about ideas about community, sort of who's part of us and who do we relate to, obligations we have to others, especially those who are in great need, such as refugees. And last but not least, the notion of kind of in moments of crisis, what do we look like? What do we do? And there's a tendency overall to see sometimes refugees as someone else's problem. After all, they're not members of our society in terms of citizenship. Until we accept them, they're somehow foreign, they're somehow from away. And this isn't simply in Canada, but around the world. There's somehow the outsider, the other. And often we sort of think about our connections to them, and sometimes they're legal obligations, maybe something under the convention, or humanitarian, we think we're doing good. But COVID-19 sort of provides a new one or a different one, which really is public health as a core factor. And this notion that when refugees and others and other migrants, other people who are sort of in that sort of marginalized, vulnerable condition, when they're in precarious situations, regardless of how they came to be there, regardless what choices were made or not made, the health of all is affected in the end, right? So the notion that borders are closed, it doesn't really so much become relevant as to how people got here. It's more now a question of what do we do as communities in order to ensure public health, both in terms of the individual level, but at the community level. And certainly one of the great challenges is that question of invisibility, visibility, even without social distancing. It was always hard to sort of, see the connection sometimes between refugees and ourselves, except as maybe how we see them in the media. And now with social distancing, it's even more difficult. More people are below the radar, more people are off the grid, more people are facing challenges, and not necessarily, we don't even know that they're facing those challenges and know how to reach them. So there's a sort of heightened need to sort of try to render people and help people to make themselves visible in this period. And in some ways, Canada's done that pretty well in terms of human needs, and certainly, again, looking at Ontario and its healthcare policy, looking at the CERB and the accessibility, there are lots of ways in which we can ensure that people can have their basic needs met by making programs open, by not worrying as much about status of individuals, but worrying more about needs of individuals and ensuring that we can meet them. And certainly, while we've done much, the indication is for refugees, there's probably much more we need to do. And certainly the unevenness of health coverage across Canada is noteworthy in particular, but also just making sure that given the various barriers refugees and other marginalized populations face, being proactive to ensure that people are able to access, not just formally, but in reality, some of the supports that might be very, very important, ensuring that we sort of navigate COVID-19 well as a community. And the human needs context, one thing I think going forward, where will we stand? There'll be some really sort of important questions to ask about the long-term consequences, economically, in terms of health, in terms of integration, for refugees, for all Canadians, but certainly for refugees moving forward. These months of seclusion, of isolation are going to have effects. And we're going to have to really probably think creatively about how we address them and then be open to thinking about how we address them. Human rights is obviously another aspect where we think about, where do we and will we stand? And in some respects, obviously, we've done quite well in that sense of, moving the process of refugee determination, just sort of putting a pause on it, letting everything settle, because we can't do it well right now. And so we shouldn't move forward with it until conditions are right and we can actually treat people fairly and ensure a greater and adequate level of due process, of justice, a fair hearing. Moving forward, one of the things that's really important to do is think about what happens once we begin to get back into the office, right? What happens when governments are running not from home, but from their offices, and when the borders open up and people are moving in, people returning to work, refugee claimants will probably still face a lot of constraints on their abilities to do things such as get documentation, to get access to meetings, to go to meetings, to be healthy, to do all things they need to do in order to present their claim to the best of their abilities. And so something moving forward will be the need to sort of reintegrate both decision makers and refugee claimants and those who support them into a process again that gives sort of due weight to those needs in order to ensure that justice continues to be done. Because there will be particular challenges I think refugees face coming out of social distancing. The other human rights issue is certainly the US border, which Canada has renewed its agreement, so refugee claimants continue to be turned back, which means Canada continues to at least be contributing to processes that could lead to refoulement, right? And certainly the UNHCR has asked states not to do this, and so we're going against the advice of the UNHCR. And there's a bigger fear, perhaps, that once the borders open, that we'll continue with this policy. Canada, for a number of years, has been negotiating with the US because it wanted to try to make it, I think, more difficult, perhaps, for people to come through the irregular way rather than through the official border point. And so there's a concern that after this, it won't be going back to allowing people to come to make a claim, but actually will be to continue these restrictions, which will again continue to place Canada in the context of being party to refoulement. And so the last thing is to just put on the table here, some changes are going to be easier than others. There's going to be challenging for sure. Refugee policy has always been challenging for a lot of different reasons, and there's no reason to think this will be any less so. Indeed, many think it will be more so. But there's some things that probably Canada could do to sort of align itself more with human rights, human needs, and visibility. One would be to open up the border to those asylum seekers coming through the US. That would allow us to align ourselves with our convention commitments more directly in terms of non-refoulement. But as well, it's clear the numbers aren't very great and we have the capacity. So it's a contribution we could make to public health, not just in Canada, not just with respect to refugees, but in North America and beyond, perhaps. Certainly, Canada can continue to consult with the UNHCR and stakeholders. I'm doing a lot of that, and I think that would be really important, working with those who are on the front lines with refugees to try to figure out how best to get back to not normal, then the new normal. And what will that new normal look like? And what do we need to do to change how we used to do things? Because our circumstances have changed and refugees have changed. A third idea that's been out is maybe we need some kind of program to regularize the status of people who are in Canada. Certainly, it's got the most focus with people who are working in the health sector, as people who aren't Canadian citizens, who are refugee claimants, who may even be subject to deportation. Would it be appropriate, perhaps, to have some kind of policy in place where we could regularize their status to bring them into the community as a way of recognizing the contributions they made? But that conversation could carry to others who have been part of this with us for the last several months, probably for the next few months to come. And the last bit of advice, perhaps, or the idea moving forward, and it'll be difficult, would be to take the time to rebuild and retool. No area of public policy will be the same after this, and refugees is right up there with the others. And so how do we not simply consolidate the restrictions? After all, we're now in an era of border closures and limiting access. How do we emerge from that in a way that allows us to reaffirm and realize a lot of those protection principles that we sort of signed up for when we talked about and signed on to the International Convention? All right, the last slide, and I just put two quotes here because I thought they sort of captured some broad ideas and sort of were well phrased. And one is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi. If ever we need reminding that we live in an interconnected world, the virus has brought that home. And certainly in the context of refugees, the notion that that virus knows no borders, it doesn't sort of, recognize languages. It is truly global and can threaten everyone. And therefore, only by protecting everyone do we avoid that threat. And especially for those who are most vulnerable and marginalized, that becomes important because they're least able to protect themselves, perhaps. So the interconnectedness comes through, certainly. So as we increase border restrictions, we need to think about down the road as we open them up, how we need to reconnect with the world and the ways in which we do that. And the second is from the Canadian Council for Refugees, an advocacy group in Canada that sort of looks out for the protection of refugees. And they state, these moments define our humanity. We must remain open to refugees and vulnerable migrants. And we can certainly think back to other eras, most dramatically, certainly World War II, out of which our whole contemporary refugee policy sort of comes out of in some degree as a response to the way in which at that point our humanity was defined by turning refugees away. Whether it's the St. Louis, the boat with Jews that came towards Canada and Canada turned it back and many of them died in the Holocaust, to other ways we were restrictive. We don't look back upon those moments and those moments in crisis with great pride. In fact, we apologize and seek atonement for them. And so I think it's always healthy in that sense to think about, certainly moments of crisis, what we're doing and how 20, 30, 40 years we'll look back and how will that demonstrate who we are and what we stand for. And certainly in that sort of more global and human rights aspect, remaining open to refugees and other vulnerable migrants could be a really important way. And with that, it only remains for me to thank you for joining this LALL Lifelong Learning at Home talk. It's been a pleasure to pull it together. I had a lot of fun the last couple of weeks thinking about this, and I hope that it was enjoyable or something you could learn from. If you have any questions, I did put my email address here and would certainly welcome any emails and be happy to respond. Hopefully we will all, in the not too distant future, be able to see one another in classrooms. Until then, stay safe, everybody, and once again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for your lecture. Chris has provided some additional materials you may wish to review following this lecture to further your learning. These materials have been provided on the course webpage. We know that learning has and always will be a social activity, so we encourage you to share this lecture with friends and family to discuss what you have learned today. If you'd like to learn more about the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning, please visit wlu.ca/LALL.